Society has sold you a massive, dangerous lie about what empathy actually is. You have been conditioned to believe that an empath is simply someone who is sensitive. You picture someone who cries during commercials, someone who acts as a willing doormat for the toxic people in their lives, someone who is fundamentally weak. But biologically and psychologically, empathy is not a weakness. It is the most advanced, hyper-calibrated threat detection system in the human brain. When you walk into a room, you might notice the furniture or who is talking the loudest. When an empath walks into a room, they are instantly, subconsciously running a behavioral analysis on every single person in their vicinity. While you are speaking to them, they are reading your blink rate. They are registering the slight pupil dilation when you tell a half-truth. They feel the microtension in your jaw, the shift in your vocal cadence, and the exact moment your baseline behavior deviates. They are a walking, breathing polygraph machine, absorbing terabytes of human data every single second. Predators, narcissists, sociopaths, everyday manipulators naturally target them. A manipulator looks at an empath and sees a limitless battery they can drain. They push boundaries, they gaslight, they extract, and they exploit. And for a long time, the empath takes it. They absorb the toxicity because their primary neurological drive is to heal, to harmonize, and to de-escalate. They don't fight back because their empathy allows them to look through the abuse and see the broken, insecure child inside the abuser. They excuse the behavior, they absorb the blow, until the math suddenly changes. Every human nervous system has a threshold. There is a precise neurological breaking point where the brain recognizes that continuing to absorb damage is a fatal threat to survival. When that line is crossed, the empathy doesn't just shut off. That's the myth. It doesn't disappear. It inverts. It weaponizes. If you are the one pushing them when this happens, you will feel the shift in the room's atmospheric pressure. The empath will stop crying. They will stop negotiating. They will stop trying to explain their feelings to you. Their emotional baseline will drop to an absolute chilling zero. You are about to find out exactly what happens when a person who knows every single one of your hidden flaws, your darkest fears, and your most desperately guarded insecurities decides that they no longer want to heal you. They want to dismantle you. What I am about to show you is the exact behavioral anatomy of that shift. Stick with me, because by the time we are done here today, you will completely rewrite your definition of power, and you will never ever look at the nice, quiet person in your life the same way again. I want you to think of the most forgiving, patient person you know, the one who always gives the benefit of the doubt. The one who has swallowed their own anger 1,000 times just to keep the peace in your relationship, your office, or your family. Now, I want you to imagine that person looking at you with the cold, dead eyes of a cartel hitman. If you want to understand human behavior at its absolute extremes, you have to look at what happens when our deepest hardwiring gets flipped. For the next 20 minutes, we are going to look at the most dangerous psychological shift a human being can undergo. Because if you understand this, you understand the very foundation of leverage, influence, and control. When we talk about profiling, we talk about establishing a baseline. A baseline is how someone acts when they are under zero stress. For an empath, their baseline is absorption. They naturally map the emotions of everyone around them. They are data collection machines. Let's say a manipulator enters the empath's life. The manipulator begins their standard operating procedure: testing boundaries, deploying guilt, gaslighting, shifting blame. The empath catalogs all of this. They don't react with hostility because they are busy analyzing. They are building a psychological profile of the manipulator. They know exactly why the manipulator needs to feel superior. They know exactly which daddy issues, which deep-seated inadequacies, and which massive insecurities drive the toxic behavior. The manipulator mistakes this silence, this absorption, for stupidity. They think, I am getting away with it. I am in control. That is the fatal error of the predatory mind. When the empath finally snaps, It is not a temper tantrum. It is not a screaming match. It is a highly calculated surgical strike. The empath's limbic system, the emotional center of the brain, essentially detaches from the manipulator. The warmth vanishes, the tone of voice flatlines, the facial expressions wipe clean. If you've ever seen this happen, it is terrifying. The person who used to care so deeply suddenly looks at the manipulator the way you or I would look at a piece of lint on our jacket. It is a complete withdrawal of supply. Remember all that data the empath collected? Every secret the manipulator spilled, every micro-expression of fear they showed, every vulnerability they accidentally exposed over months or years. The empath now has all of it categorized and loaded. When the manipulator tries their usual tricks, when they try to incite guilt or rage, the empath doesn't get defensive. Instead, they state the manipulator's deepest, darkest truth out loud, with zero emotion. They don't yell. They just dismantle the manipulator's ego with absolute, terrifying precision. They hit the exact psychological pressure points that the manipulator has spent their entire life trying to hide. They will look a narcissist in the eye and, in a perfectly calm voice, dissect their exact insecurities until the manipulator is stripped bare. Once the empath snaps, the bridge isn't burned, it is vaporized. The empathy that the manipulator relied on to get away with their behavior is gone forever, replaced by an impenetrable boundary. The empath no longer sees a broken person who needs saving. They just see a threat, and they neutralize it by removing their presence, their energy, and their attention permanently. You cannot negotiate with an empath who has reached this state. You cannot manipulate them because they are already 10 steps ahead of your script. They wrote the script. They know you better than you know yourself. So the next time you are sitting across from someone who is patiently absorbing your stress, your demands, or your toxicity, someone you think you have perfectly under your thumb, ask yourself a question. Are they actually surrendering to you? Or are they just gathering the data they need to completely dismantle you when they finally decide they've had enough? To understand the absolute lethality of an empath who has reached their limit, we first have to completely demolish the cultural myth of what empathy actually is. Society has programmed you to view empathy through the lens of weakness. You hear the word empath and you immediately picture a bleeding heart. You picture someone who absorbs everyone else's emotional baggage, someone who gets easily overwhelmed, someone who is fundamentally soft, malleable, and easy to exploit. You have been told that empathy is a liability in a ruthless world. But this is a catastrophic misunderstanding of human biology and neuromechanics. Empathy is not a passive state of emotional bleeding. It is, quite literally, the most sophisticated intelligence-gathering mechanism engineered by evolution. Think about what is actually happening when a highly empathetic person enters a dynamic environment. While the average person is distracted by surface-level noise, who is wearing what, who is speaking the loudest, what the explicit agenda of a conversation is, the empath's nervous system is quietly running a massive, high-speed diagnostic. They are not merely feeling things, they are acquiring high-value data. They operate as a highly calibrated behavioral profiling supercomputer, running continuous, invisible scans on human firmware. Without even consciously trying, they are establishing a behavioral baseline for every single person in their immediate vicinity. They are registering the exact respiratory rate of the person sitting across from them. They notice the microtension in the jaw muscles of the colleague who is pretending to be relaxed. They track the blink rate, the shifts in weight, and the precise angle of a foot pointed toward the door. They feel the slight, almost imperceptible shift in emotional temperature when an insecure, toxic individual walks into the room. When a manipulator looks at an empath, They see a mark. They see someone they can overwhelm with a fabricated sob story or intimidate with subtle, aggressive posturing. What the manipulator fails to realize is that the empath's brain is simultaneously recording every single discrepancy in their presentation. When the manipulator tells a lie, the average person might buy it because the words sound convincing. The empath, however, subconsciously flags the microsecond delay in speech, the subtle drop in vocal cadence, the asymmetrical smile, and the slight pupil dilation. They might not aggressively confront the lie in that exact moment because their primary biological drive is to maintain social homeostasis. But make no mistake, the data is being stored. They are downloading your psychological blueprint. An empath does not just hear the words vibrating out of your mouth. They read the operating system driving those words. They can clearly see the frightened, unloved child hiding behind the aggressive mask of a grown narcissist. They recognize the desperate need for validation that is actively masquerading as arrogance. Every single interaction you have with them is, in reality, a one-sided intelligence debriefing. You might think you are successfully pushing their boundaries or bending their reality to fit your narrative, but you are actually just handing them the master keys to your own psychological architecture. You are continuously exposing your deepest insecurities, your unhealed trauma, your triggers, and your blind spots. For months, sometimes years, they simply absorb this data. They meticulously organize it. They tolerate the toxic behavior not because they lack a spine, but because their advanced threat detection system is temporarily overridden by their hardwired nurturing instinct. They use their profound profiling skills to excuse your behavior, to understand the mechanics of why you are broken, and to attempt to heal you. But all the while, that intelligence dossier is growing infinitely thicker, and the behavioral map of your darkest vulnerabilities is becoming impossibly precise. There is a precise biological mathematics to human tolerance. For the empath, this tolerance appears infinite to the untrained observer. You watch them absorb emotional blows, excuse toxic behavior, and constantly re-regulate the chaotic environments created by the manipulators around them. But the human nervous system is not a bottomless well. It is a highly regulated mechanical system bound by the strict laws of biology. What you are witnessing during those months or years of absorption is not infinite patience. It is the gradual, systematic loading of stress onto a psychological fault line. The empath's brain is continuously running a cost-benefit analysis at the subconscious level. Their limbic system, heavily biased toward connection and healing, keeps secreting oxytocin and dopamine to override the cortisol spikes caused by the abuse. They are biochemically drugging themselves into staying, convincing their own threat detection system that the predator can be saved, managed, or healed, effectively silencing their own internal alarms. But eventually, the math changes. You hit the terminal threshold. This is not a gradual fading of affection or a slow emotional burnout. It is a violent, instantaneous neurological event. We call this the breaking point, but it is far more accurate to describe it as an absolute physiological override. At a specific moment, often triggered by something seemingly insignificant, a final microscopic drop in an overflowing bucket, the empath's brain recognizes that continuing to prioritize the manipulator's emotional needs is a direct existential threat to their own survival. The anterior cingulate cortex, the region of the brain that governs empathy, compassion, and emotional regulation, essentially throws a circuit breaker. The nurturing drive is forcefully, completely shut down to preserve the biological host. If you know what to look for, you can observe the exact physiological markers of this shift in real time. The transformation is chilling. You will not see the typical signs of an emotional meltdown. There is no flushed skin, no hyperventilation, no raised voice, and no erratic defensive hand gestures. Instead, the sympathetic nervous system disengages the standard panic response, and the parasympathetic system drops the empath into a state of absolute predatory calm. Their resting heart rate actively decelerates. Their breathing slows and becomes deeply diaphragmatic. The micro-expressions of distress, anxiety, or sadness that normally dance across their face vanish entirely, replaced by a terrifyingly blank, symmetrical baseline expression. The microscopic tension in their jaw releases, but their eyes lock on with a dead, unblinking intensity. This is the look of someone whose emotional software has just been uninstalled and replaced with pure, unadulterated survival logic. Psychologically, the empath has just evicted the manipulator from their sphere of compassion. The deep cognitive empathy that previously allowed them to feel the manipulator's pain, to justify their childhood trauma, and to forgive their daily transgressions evaporates into thin air. They no longer see a broken human being standing in front of them. They see a raw data point. They see a mechanical obstacle that needs to be dismantled. The immense neurological resources that were previously dedicated to maintaining harmony and protecting the manipulator's ego are instantly reallocated to threat neutralization. The empath is no longer experiencing the situation through the lens of a caregiver, but has instead shifted into the cold, calculated processing speed of a field tactician. The manipulator is still operating under the arrogant assumption that they are dealing with a soft, forgiving target, completely unaware that the biological locks have just been changed, the security systems have been armed, and the vulnerable person they once knew has effectively ceased to exist in that room. Once the neurological threshold is crossed, the vast repository of psychological intelligence the empath has been involuntarily compiling ceases to be a tool for understanding and instantly becomes a weapon of mass behavioral destruction. For the entirety of the relationship, the manipulator has operated under the fatal delusion that the empath's silence was a symptom of submission. They mistook a lack of retaliation for a lack of ammunition. What they utterly fail to comprehend is that the empath has spent every waking second inside the manipulator's psychological architecture, mapping the load-bearing walls of their fragile ego. The empath knows exactly where the foundation is cracked. They know the precise location of the unhealed trauma, the desperate feelings of inadequacy, and the agonizing fear of exposure that the manipulator goes to such toxic, destructive lengths to conceal from the rest of the world. Up until this exact moment, the empath has actively protected those vulnerabilities, acting as a biological shield for the manipulator's self-esteem and constantly absorbing the collateral damage of their projections. But when the empath snaps, that shield is not merely dropped, it is forged into a scalpel. The weaponization of vulnerability is the most terrifying phase of this behavioral shift because it is executed with zero malice, zero volume, and absolute surgical precision. When the manipulator inevitably launches their next attack, expecting the usual cycle of gaslighting, blame shifting, or aggressive posturing to produce tears, apologies, or defensive rage, the empath does not take the bait. They do not raise their voice, they do not justify their actions, and they do not defend their own character. Instead, they look directly through the manipulator's fabricated mask and calmly, systematically read their deepest insecurities out loud. They deploy the exact behavioral data points required to dismantle the manipulator's false reality. It is a psychological vivisection performed in broad daylight, stripping away the carefully constructed layers of narcissistic defense mechanisms to expose the terrified, hyper-vigilant core underneath. The empath will casually reference the exact inadequacy the manipulator spends their entire life trying to outrun. stating it not as a heated insult, but as a cold, clinical, undeniable fact. They will neutralize an hour-long tirade with a single, perfectly calibrated sentence that hits the absolute dead center of the manipulator's most desperately guarded fear. Because the empath's cognitive empathy is still highly functioning, now completely divorced from emotional warmth or the desire to nurture, they know exactly how to bypass the manipulator's standard cognitive defenses. They do not engage with the superficial anger or the overt manipulation tactics. They simply bypass the noise and strike directly at the psychological root. The manipulator suddenly finds their entire reality collapsing, their entire playbook rendered completely useless by a target who absolutely refuses to play the emotional victim. The profound shock to the manipulator's nervous system is catastrophic, triggering an immediate and severe cognitive dissonance. They are suddenly forced to stare down the barrel of their own mirrored reflection, held up by someone who knows their darkest, most shameful secrets, who understands the pathetic nature of their need for control, and who is no longer willing to soften the blow of reality. The psychological leverage has instantly and violently shifted, leaving the manipulator paralyzed by the realization that the person they arrogantly assumed they were breaking down has actually been holding the detonation codes to their entire identity since the very first day they met, possessing the absolute power to dismantle their carefully curated persona with nothing more than a few quietly spoken words that strip away the illusion of dominance and leave the predator entirely exposed to the exact psychological devastation they spent their entire life trying to inflict on others. When we analyze human conflict, we are conditioned to look for volume. We associate the breaking point with a theatrical explosion of kinetic energy, shattered plates, screaming matches, hysterical crying, and frantic physical posturing. But behaviorally speaking, a loud reaction is a deeply reassuring signal to a manipulator. Anger, tears, and desperation all require a massive expenditure of emotional calories. And more importantly, they require hope. When someone is screaming at you, they are desperately trying to force you to understand their pain. They are still actively invested in the dynamic. They still care what you think. Therefore, the absolute most terrifying response a predator can encounter is not a spike in volume, but a sudden, deafening drop to an absolute zero emotion baseline. The true empathic snap is entirely silent, and that silence is the most dangerous behavioral footprint on the planet. To understand why this is so devastating, you have to understand how a manipulator navigates their reality. Toxic individuals, particularly those on the narcissistic or sociopathic spectrum, operate using a form of emotional echolocation. They constantly ping the people around them with provocations, guilt trips, or subtle aggressions, and they use the resulting emotional bounce back, the defense, the tears, the apologies, to orient themselves. That emotional reaction is their supply. It is the radar that tells them they are in control of the environment. When the empath finally hits their terminal threshold and the biological switch flips, that radar screen instantly goes completely black. The empath stops producing the emotional frequency the manipulator relies on to survive. They do not offer the silent treatment, which is merely a passive-aggressive manipulation tactic designed to elicit a response. Instead, they offer a profound, absolute absence of emotional resonance. The physiological manifestation of this silence is incredibly unnerving to witness. The empath's vocal cords physically relax, completely stripping their speech of all prosody, the natural melody and emotional inflection of human communication. When they do speak, the cadence is perfectly flat, robotic, and clinically detached. The micro-movements of their face, which previously telegraphed empathy and concern, completely freeze. They look at the manipulator, but they are no longer making eye contact to connect. They are merely tracking a moving object in their visual field. For the manipulator, this creates an immediate, suffocating atmospheric pressure drop in the room. They throw out their best bait, a deeply insulting comment, a fabricated accusation, a threat of abandonment, and it simply drops to the floor in total silence. There is no defense to exploit. There is no anger to judo throw back at the empath. There is only a terrifying, empty void. An angry opponent is entirely predictable because their emotions make them sloppy and reactive. A terrified opponent is easy to control because their fear dictates their movements. But a completely silent, emotionally flatlined empath is a tactical nightmare. They are no longer leaking any behavioral intelligence. They are giving the manipulator absolutely zero data to work with, while simultaneously processing the manipulator's escalating panic with cold, mechanical precision. The manipulator suddenly realizes, with a creeping sense of primal dread, that the silence they are experiencing is not a pause in the argument, nor is it a temporary withdrawal to lick wounds. It is the absolute, chilling silence of a predator who has stopped observing the bait and has quietly locked their sights onto the prey, operating entirely on cold logic and possessing the unshakable, terrifying patience of someone who no longer needs you to understand them. The most profound cognitive error a manipulator makes in the aftermath of the empathic snap is operating under the assumption that the withdrawal is temporary. They rely heavily on historical data. In the past, the empath has always returned, always forgiven, and always allowed their boundaries to be renegotiated after a sufficient cooling-off period. The manipulator naturally assumes that this terrifying flatline response is simply a severe mood swing, a temporary defensive posture that can eventually be bypassed with their standard love-bombing tactics, manufactured crises, or weaponized pity. What they fundamentally fail to understand is that the empath has not simply changed their mood or adopted a temporary coping mechanism. Their brain has undergone a permanent structural neurological recalibration. The neural pathways that previously governed attachment, compassion, and benefit of the doubt processing regarding this specific individual have been biologically severed and cauterized. This is not a boundary that can be pushed, negotiated, or charmed away, because the boundary is no longer a psychological concept. It has become a hardwired autonomic survival reflex that treats the manipulator precisely the same way the body's immune system treats a lethal pathogen. When we clinically map the behavioral matrix of an empath post-snap, we observe a complete, irreversible reclassification of the manipulator. The empath's brain essentially takes the manipulator's entire profile, the specific cadence of their voice, their micro-expressions, their digital footprint, and their very physical presence in a room, and permanently transfers it from the social connection category into the environmental hazard category. The biological locks have been permanently changed, and the key has been incinerated. When the manipulator inevitably attempts a desperate hoovering maneuver, sending a perfectly crafted text, or orchestrating a highly theatrical coincidental run-in designed to elicit the old supply of empathy, they are met with a chilling reality. The empath does not experience the familiar spike of cortisol, the conditioned anxiety, or the overwhelming guilt that used to control them. Instead, they observe the manipulator's frantic attempts at re-engagement with the detached clinical apathy of a forensic scientist watching a predictable chemical reaction. The love bombing that used to work so effortlessly now registers to the empath as an utterly pathetic, transparently mechanical manipulation tactic, sparking absolutely zero internal conflict within their newly, perfectly regulated nervous system. This recalibration is absolute and permanent because it is fundamentally rooted in the empath's newly acquired baseline of unapologetic self-preservation. The profound hypervigilance and elite data-gathering capabilities that once kept them locked in a relentless cycle of appeasement and suffering are now permanently repurposed to maintain the impenetrable integrity of their own psychological perimeter. They no longer waste a single kilojoule of metabolic energy trying to lovingly decode the manipulator's hidden childhood trauma or patiently decipher the deeper meaning behind their toxic behavior.